The Executive in the Federalist, Lecture 1. In the last series of lectures, I talked a little bit about the envisioned character and role of Congress in the federal government as explained in Federalists 57 and 62. And just to remind you, the way that Madison frames that discussion is by saying, look, the role of Congress is to make laws for the public good. So if that is your purpose, then you need two things from your legislature. And more generally, there are two things you need from your government. You want the people who hold office and exercise political power, to aim at the public good, right? You don't want them to be corrupt. You don't want them to be self-interested. You want the people who hold office to be interested in serving the public good. But on the other hand, you also need them to be enlightened about the public good. They need to have, so alongside the virtue that makes them want the common good, they need the wisdom that helps them to discern what would be the best law in any given instance for attaining the public good. So they need virtue and they need wisdom. And you need to organize the government, therefore, in such a way that those who hold office are kept honest. You want to organize institutions in such a way that minimize the chances and the incentives for corruption, for using public office for private gain and things like that. But you also want to organize those offices in a way that encourage enlightened deliberation about the public good. And that's why, there's a real focus, especially in the discussion of the Senate, on deliberation, on the need to create a legislature that doesn't make just any old laws, but is actually capable of making good laws. And so we went through how Congress is organized in that regard. Now, the same considerations, broadly speaking, apply to the executive branch. With the branch of the government that executes the law, you also want those who hold office within the executive, especially at the top of the executive branch, to have both a virtue that makes them want the public good and enlightenment to help them discern what the public good requires. But the virtue of the executive is going to be quite different from the virtue of a legislature. You want your legislature to be, to have quite a few people for the sake of collective deliberation. You want that collective deliberation to be forced to take into consideration many different interests and opinions. And therefore, you want it to be able to, you want it to, under most circumstances, to move rather slowly. Because if you make your laws too quickly in too great haste, oftentimes you're going to end up with bad laws. But things are different with the executive, especially because when you think about it, in America, the head of the executive branch is a single person, the president. So the president is ultimately responsible for the execution of the law domestically. And as you recall from the Constitution lectures, he doesn't do it all personally. What happens is this: Congress makes laws, and in addition to making laws, Congress makes executive agencies. That is, particular, sort of offices or departments within the executive branch that have particular responsibilities, right? So you've got the Defense Department, which is primarily responsible for overseeing military affairs. You have the State Department, which is primarily responsible for overseeing and conducting diplomatic relations with other countries. You've got the Environmental Protection Agency, which oversees environmental, and implements environmental regulations, and so on and so forth. You have lots of different particular agencies. And the way it works is the president doesn't run all of those things directly. The president, at the top of the chain of command within the executive branch, appoints the people who run those agencies. So he picks his team, the people that are going to run those particular agencies for him. And then he's responsible for what they do. And we'll talk about how that works later. But so the president works by being at the top of the executive branch and by choosing and guiding the people who run the various parts of the executive branch. So that's kind of the president's role domestically. But alongside that, the president really wears two hats, because the president in the Constitution is not only the chief executive, the one ultimately responsible for the execution of the laws in the United States. The president is also the chief representative of the United States in the United States dealings with foreign nations. And that is both diplomatic relations and also military relations, right? So the president has quite a bit of responsibility and is really in the driver's seat when it comes to foreign relations, because the president is the commander in chief. So the president is at the top of the chain of military command, originally the Army and the Navy, and now of all the armed forces, which I believe includes Space Force also. So the president is in charge, ultimately at the top of the chain of command of the entire U.S. military establishment. And as commander-in-chief is ultimately responsible for conducting the war effort. Obviously, again, in consultation with aides and generals and all of that. Not everything is done single-handedly, but the president is the ultimate decision maker in military policy, but also in diplomatic policy. The president, so the executive branch is in charge of receiving and dealing with foreign ambassadors, so foreign countries and their ambassadors and their diplomatic relations with us. The president appoints the U.S. ambassadors that represent the United States in their dealings with other particular nations. Again, the Senate has to confirm presidential appointees, but the president picks the people who are our ambassadors. The president chooses the Secretary of State, the person who's in charge of the State Department. The State Department oversees, all of our diplomatic relations with other countries. The president negotiates treaties with foreign nations. Again, 2/3 of the Senate has to confirm the treaty, but the president's the one that negotiates. So the president's in the driver's seat, right? So if there's a national emergency, people look to the president, right? So if there's a domestic, if there's some kind of disaster like Hurricane Katrina or something like that domestically, or the current, at the time of this recording, the COVID-19 pandemic. At the national level, people don't look in the first place to Congress. They look to the president for the kind of the quick response to these things. If there's some kind of domestic insurrection, riots, or something like that, that governors at the state level can't handle, you look to the president. If there's a foreign invasion, you look to the president. September 19th, right, where you have planes are being hijacked. There's some terrorist attack of unknown scope. People look to the president to make quick decisions about how to respond to keep the country safe. So the president has a lot of responsibilities in terms of domestic and foreign affairs. And that's why, as Hamilton argues in Federalist 70, obviously you want a president who is virtuous, who wants the public good, and you want a president who is enlightened about how to attain that public good. But that doesn't mean that you want that deliberation is the chief virtue of an executive, right? Deliberation, Congress needs to be able to think long and well and carefully about policy. On the other hand, when it comes to the president, the chief virtue of the president, according to Hamilton, is what he calls energy, which you could translate as saying the ability to act quickly, the ability to act forcefully, and the ability to act with resolution or to act decisively. So notice the ability not just to make a decision, but to stick with that decision and see it out and not be deflected from one's course. So energy is really the virtue in the executive, both because of the nature of the president's executive functions internally and because of the nature of the president's responsibilities in representing the foreign relations, representing the United States in its relations with other countries. So the president needs energy. And so a lot of the what I had you read, these selections from Federalist 70, 71, and 73, are Hamilton's account of why you need energy in the executive, how you can nonetheless make sure that the executive power is relatively safe from abuse. So why you need energy, how to make the executive power safe, and then what particular institutional requirements are needed in order to have an energetic executive. So it kind of explains why the office of the president is set up the way it is in order to provide a chief executive who is energetic. So just a few other things. So remember, under the Articles of Confederation, prior to the Constitution, there was a national legislature. It was called the United States in Congress assembled. So each state sent representatives to this assembly, and the assembly made rules for the general affairs of the nation. So it was supposed to oversee the kind of general affairs, especially war and peace, diplomatic relations. But the Articles of Confederation did not give the national government the power to enforce its own laws. Instead, it depended upon the state governments to comply with national directives. So it would raise an army by requesting men and material from each state, and then the state government was supposed to comply with that request by actually raising money, raising materials, raising people. So in the same way, for example, to pay off the national debt, the national government would send requisitions to the state governments, and then the state governments were supposed to actually do the taxing to get the money to send to the national government. But the national government couldn't draft people, it couldn't tax people, it could not directly govern people. It could only act through the compliance of the state governments. So since the national government couldn't enforce coercively its own regulations, the national government, under the Articles of Confederation, did not have a separate executive branch. Rather, it just had, within the legislative assembly, there would be basically a committee made up of some of the members of the assembly that oversaw the day-to-day operations of the national government. So to the extent that there was an executive, it was just sort of a committee of the whole with rotating membership. So there was no separate executive branch, in the same way that under the Articles there was no separate judicial branch. That even though there were laws made at the national level, it was actually each state's court system that was responsible for the interpretation of national laws within its own territory. So there's only a legislative branch in the Articles of Confederation. In the proposed Constitution, on the other hand, you have a full-blown national government, because the Constitution gives the federal government the power to enforce its own laws. So it can raise its own taxes, it can enforce its own laws, and all of that. And so that means that in addition to a legislature, you also needed a judicial branch, a federal judicial branch, to hear cases under federal law before those laws could be enforced. And you also needed an executive branch to administer the law, to oversee the day-to-day operations of government, and to enforce the law, and of course also to represent the country in its dealings with foreign nations. So the Constitution gives you three different branches of government. So then this raises the question of how are we going to organize the executive branch? Because you had a lot of people that were extremely wary of the executive, right? They had just recently fought a war of independence to free themselves from being under the control of what they saw as an arbitrary and despotic king. And so they were very worried that if they created executive power at the state level or at the national level that was too powerful, that you would end up with something like that again. You would end up with another tyrant who would use his power over the administration of government, especially power over the military, to establish himself as some kind of dictator. So at the state level, obviously the chief executive at the state level is the governor. The governor is responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operations of the government, the enforcement of the law at the state level. And governors were oftentimes rather weak in the state constitutions because they didn't want the executive power to be too strong. So it falls to Hamilton in Article 70 to defend what to a number of people seemed to be an astoundingly monarchical looking executive branch in the federal government, because you had one president, one person, one mind, and one will ultimately in charge of the executive branch and of the administration of government, ultimately in charge of the military, ultimately in charge of, sort of foreign policy decisions. So some people looked at this and said, you're just asking for trouble here. This office of the president, this is really just a launching pad for a tyrant. This is too powerful. You can't concentrate that much power in the hands of one person and not end up with some kind of tyrant. So this is truly objectionable. And so Hamilton, as I said, it falls to Hamilton to defend this singular, energetic executive as necessary for protecting the life, liberty, and property of citizens, right? Because people looked at it and said, this is a tyrant in the making. He will ultimately become extremely dangerous and destructive to the life, liberty, and property of citizens. And Hamilton's response is, you need a single energetic executive in order to effectively secure the life, liberty, and property of citizens. That's his argument. And although we don't read it, part of his critique of the Articles of Confederation was that the Articles of Confederation were too weak. He says to a lot of his fellow Americans, look, because of your experience with Britain, because of your experience with the British Parliament, because especially of your experience with the British King, you're really, really worried about the government being too powerful and too oppressive. So you spend a lot of time thinking about how you can limit governmental power. And Hamilton says, well, guess what? Yes, an overly powerful government can be extremely dangerous to the liberty of the people. But you know what else is dangerous to the liberty of the people? A government that's too weak. Because if a government's too weak, it can't protect you. So you need a government, yes, it shouldn't be overly strong and oppressive, but it's got to be powerful. If you don't have a strong government, your rights aren't secure. So for all of your thinking about how to limit governmental power, you also have to think about how to enable responsible government power. And that's where the president comes in for Hamilton. So that's what we'll get to in the next lecture. I will talk about Hamilton's argument for why energy is needed, and also what provisions in the Constitution provide safeguards against the president abusing his power. So in the next lecture, we'll talk about the need for energy and how to make it safe. And then in the third lecture, we will talk about the ingredients of energy, that is, the particular aspects of the constitutional office of president that are meant to make it possible to have a president who can act quickly and decisively and forcefully in protecting the nation and administering the government.